Thank you, ma'am. Salam, everyone, and a warm welcome to the launch of our report titled Erasing Barriers, Enhancing Safety, a review of systems and strategies for supporting Muslim women and girls facing gender-based violence. As we kick off today's program, let us collectively take a moment to extend our thoughts, prayers, and deepest condolences to our Palestinian sisters and brothers facing genocide in Gaza and the occupied territories. In solidarity and recognition of their resilience in the face of adversity, we will start our gathering with a Fatiha in translation, followed by a moment of silence. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. All praises for Allah, Lord of the worlds, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Master of the Day of Judgment, you alone we worship, and you alone we ask for help. Guide us along the straight path, the path of those you have blessed, not those you're displeased with, or those who are astray. Now please join us for a moment of silence. Thank you. May this brief reflection serve as a reminder of the challenges faced by communities around the world and inspire our commitment to fostering a world free from violence and injustice, where safety, justice, and dignity prevail for all. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that we're on today. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Piton First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to any who may be here with us today, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Miigwech. Now I'm going to pass over the mic to our Executive Director, Nuzat Jaffrey, to share a bit more about the project and how the report came about.
Thank you, Zainab. And I will apologize in advance because I've been, getting over a bout with COVID, that dastardly virus that doesn't seem to go away. So please forgive my raspy voice. I shall not speak for too long, but welcome to our launch of an amazing report that you'll hear about in a few minutes from the author, Silmi Abdullah. And the report is part of a larger project that we began about 2.5 years ago, where we decided that we were going to have 3 very distinct pieces to the project. One was to develop a review guide that will help service providers to take a look at their policies, programs, and service delivery practices in the area of gender-based violence to see if their supports and services were inclusive, if there were any barriers for Muslim women and girls that needed services. We included non-binary individuals in the process as well, because we know that 2S LGBTQ people experience discrimination and challenges besides women and girls in our communities, in the Muslim communities. And so the guide was first tested with many of our partners. And then after they gave us feedback on how effective the guide was, how useful it was, we were able to improve it further. And then we launched it about a year back, in fact, almost a year ago. And we've, people have been using it, people ask for it, they visit our website to download it. We also created a series of infographics based on the content of the guide, because the guide's very, it's got a lot of information. So to provide more accessible information, you can visit our website to download both the guide and the infographics related to it. And the other part of the project was to have to offer coordination of programs and services for Muslim women and girls who are GBV victims and survivors. So we enabled them to contact us, created an intake form. We provided lots and lots of access to information in various languages on gender-based violence. The products were geared to Muslim women in particular, and we've run several campaigns now with that material to invite people to contact us if they need services, and then we're able to support them by coordinating services for them that are specific, that are culturally specific, provided by people who are culturally competent. And so that was another aspect to the project. And then the other thing that we did was we had engaged our community partners in actually conducting reviews, and using the results, we were able to create this report. So the final product out of the project, in fact, is the report that you're going to hear about. And it's based on participating organizations doing reviews of their policies, programs, and service delivery practices. And the idea was to have a change strategy that would show us where we are today with respect to service delivery practices and policies and programs in sister organizations, in organizations that provide services to women and girls, and some were mainstream organizations, some were catering to the Muslim communities. So I'm going to pass the mic over to Silmi now. Please feel free to post your comments. Zainab, can people post comments?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they can.
And they can also ask questions using the Q&A feature. So if you have any questions as you go along, we will address the questions after Silmi has presented. And we will certainly be following your comments. So Silmi, over to you. And by the way, I'm not giving her a very long introduction because you probably saw her bio. But Silmi is an amazing analyst of legislation and poetry. She has experience working with women experiencing gender-based violence when she was at METRAC. She was a lawyer at SALCO, South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario, and has participated in many reviews of policies and legislation related to family law and different law reform projects. So over to you, Silmi.
Thank you, Nazat, and thank you so much, everyone, for coming tonight. I'm just going to, before I begin, I'm just going to share my screen quickly so you can see the presentation. So give me one moment, please. Okay, so welcome everyone to the launch of our report, Erasing Barriers, Enhancing Safety, a review of systems and strategies for supporting Muslim women and girls facing gender-based violence. So I'm very excited because this is a culmination of 2 years of work, and this has been a huge collaborative project with a number of our partner organizations. So before I begin, I want to express my heartfelt gratitude to our participating partners without whose support this project would be impossible. And of course, our advisory committee who has provided us with valuable input and advice from the very beginning. So thank you all very much. And of course, thank you to my colleagues, Zainab, Hannah, Sabrine, and Nuzhat for your support from beginning to end. So this is all, a result of our collaborative efforts. So Nuzhat has already talked a little bit about the genesis of this report and how it all came about. So I'm going to keep it brief. So this is part of CCMW's Gender-Based Violence Project, which launched in 2021. And really the goal of this project was to address the many barriers that Muslim women, girls, and gender diverse individuals face when they seek help for gender-based violence, and to strengthen supports and services for them by developing a strategy for systemic change. And this strategy entails critically reviewing policies, programs, and service delivery practices of organizations that serve GBV survivors and victims. And the reason why we focused on these 3 aspects, policies, programs, and services, is because we recognize that having policies is not enough, right? So an organization could have great policies in theory, but we want to make sure that they also translate into program design and implementation, and also service delivery practices on the ground. So in order to make sure that Muslim women and girls are being served effectively, what we wanted to assess was whether organizations have effective policies, programs, and services. So all 3 aspects. And you heard from Nuzhat that we developed a guide last year, which details the tools and strategies and criteria for conducting the reviews. Now, the idea behind the guide was really to have it or make it available as a resource that organizations could use to do a self-assessment of their policies, programs, and services as they see fit on their own time. So it's really meant to be an aid for voluntary assessments. But as far as this project is concerned, we wanted to work with a number of organizations to do the reviews, to apply the guide, just to get a glimpse into what is actually happening right now. What is the experience of Muslim women and girls? Where are some of the strengths and gaps in services, so that we can start a conversation? Of course, the results that we present in this report is not representative of Muslims in general or Muslims at large in Canada, because our sample size is small. But the idea is to get the conversation started, and hopefully we can have further reviews and larger, more quantitative studies to supplement the qualitative analysis that we did in this project. So just to give you a little bit of background on the analytical framework that we used to do the reviews. So the review guide applies the Canadian government's Gender-Based Analysis Plus, or GBA Plus, framework to the review process. And GBA Plus essentially helps organizations to critically assess how their programs and policies impact diverse groups based not only on gender, but also other intersecting identities. For example, race, disability, age, religion, ethnicity, etc. And the goal is really to assess diverse groups' experiences in engaging with policies and programs, and also to address systemic inequalities. So within this umbrella framework of Gender-Based Analysis Plus, or GBA Plus, what we did in the guide is that we recommend that organizations check whether their policies, programs, and services align with 4 principles, which we call the guiding frameworks in the guide. So these are human rights laws, trauma and violence informed approach, integrated feminist, anti-racism, anti-oppression, and cultural safety. Now, the guide goes into details about what the principles of each framework is. So I'm not going to go into too much detail because we don't have a lot of time. But just to give you a brief background, the reason why we chose human rights laws is because we believe that that is the starting point, right? Because we know that gender-based violence is rooted in patriarchy and gender inequality. And in Canada, gender equality falls within the umbrella of human rights legislation. So we have provincial and federal laws that provide important protections against discrimination based on gender and also other grounds like race, disability, sexual orientation, age, gender identity, gender expression. So really, when it comes to services, every organization has an obligation to make sure that the organization provides an environment that is free of discrimination and harassment, right? And so in order to make sure that policies, programs, and services are effective and appropriate, one of the categories we use is to check whether they're compliant with relevant human rights legislation and human rights principles. And of course, if we're working with gender-based violence survivors and victims, it's very important to use a trauma and violence informed approach, which essentially looks at the connections between trauma, violence, and negative health outcomes and behaviors. And really the goal is to increase safety and resilience for clients, and also to make sure that clients are coming into an environment that is safe, right? And to avoid harm and re-traumatization. Anti-racism, anti-oppression, of course, this framework goes beyond diversity and inclusion. What this framework does is it looks at systems and structures and how systems of oppression create experiences of inequality for marginalized communities. So are we looking at how inequalities are embedded in our systems, and are we looking at how to dismantle them? So that's what the AREO framework is all about. And integrating a feminist or incorporating an integrated feminist aspect to AREO essentially means we're looking at how these systems of oppression specifically impact survivors of violence, and how do we create a safe environment for them, and how do we ensure equality for them when they are coming into organizations to seek help. And lastly, we use the cultural safety framework. And cultural safety goes beyond concepts of cultural awareness and cultural sensitivity and cultural competence that we often hear about. This is a whole way of working where we engage in two-way learning, and we're not only trying to fit in other cultures into a dominant cultural framework, but we're kind of dismantling that hierarchy and really engaging in a process of self-reflection where we are continuously trying to learn from one another and creating a space where people are coming in and are able to express and talk about their experiences without the fear of judgment or without feeling that their culture is inferior. So those are the 4 frameworks that we use under the umbrella of JBA Plus analysis. And really the overarching question that we encourage organizations to ask when they're reviewing their policies, programs, and services is, are the policies, programs, and services effective and appropriate for Muslim women, girls, and gender diverse people facing violence? So that's the overarching question that we're trying to answer. And within that, in order to answer that, we have specific sets of questions under each framework. So for example, under human rights, we have a set of policy-related questions that organizations can ask themselves, a set of program-related questions, a set of service delivery questions. So if you look at the guide, and also if you look at the report, you'll see a whole list of questions that we've developed. Again, we don't have enough time to go through the entire list, but when we present the findings to you, some of the key findings to you, you'll see what some of the questions were that organizations answered as they reviewed their policies, programs, and services in accordance to each of these frameworks. So to give you a quick example, like for example, under human rights, when it came to policy-related questions, we asked things like, okay, does my organization have a policy on anti-discrimination and anti-harassment? Is this policy available to everybody? Are people getting trained on this policy? Are service users aware that this policy exists, and are they being educated about their rights when they come into the organization, right? Were diverse groups of people consulted in developing these policies? To give you an example of program design questions, we're looking at how accessible are the programs, are different types of accommodation being provided? And then finally, when we go into service related questions, we ask more very on the ground, what's happening on the ground. So when somebody's coming in to seek services, are they facing any incident that's discriminatory, right? Are they facing harassment? When they ask for accommodation, is that accommodation actually being provided? So those are the types of questions that we've asked, or we encourage organizations to ask when they're conducting the reviews. Just a few words on methodology. So now that we have the set of questions, like where do we get the answers from, right? So we use 3 information sources. One is policy and program related documents to review policies and programs. The second information source is the knowledge and expertise of organizational leaders, such as executive directors, program leads, and managers. And we did that to primarily review policies and programs and also gain some insight into service delivery practices. And then finally, we looked at the knowledge and lived experiences of users of an organization's services. So these would be clients or people who know of the organization. And this was done to primarily review service delivery practices and also to gain some insight into their experience with policies and programs. And how did we collect this data? So for the review of policy and program related documents, we asked each of our organizational leaders to look through their documents and answer the questions that are listed in the guide for the policy and program review. For the knowledge and expertise of organizational leaders, CCMW conducted the interviews. So I did interviews with organizational leaders of each organization by asking the questions that we developed for programs, policy and program review. And for the knowledge and experience of service users, we held focus groups and also individual interviews with service users of each organization. So what we did was we did a call out where we asked for participants to take part in the focus group or individual interviews, and then we asked certain questions to them to get better insight into what their experience has been with the organization's services. And in addition to the targeted policy, program, and service questions, we also, in the guide, we also have some background and contextual questions, both for the organizational leaders and also service users. And the purpose of this was really to situate the reviews within the broader context of Muslim survivors and victims' experiences of violence and also their experience of seeking services. So for example, when we asked some background questions to leaders, they included questions on, okay, what types of violence do they typically see among their Muslim clients? What are some of the common supports that they seek out? What are the barriers? And what are some of the current organizational efforts and challenges in addressing these barriers? And when we asked background questions to service users, we tried to get a sense of their experience of violence and their general experience of trying to find help or navigating their situation, in addition to their specific experience of getting help from their respective organization. So as I mentioned before, the analysis that we did was qualitative. So we combined all the notes that we got from the documentary reviews, the organizational leader transcripts, and service user focus groups and interviews. And we tried to get a holistic picture of some of the strengths and gaps in the organizations. And we looked at the various themes that emerge from the answers to the targeted questions. And we tried to really center the narratives that were shared by our leaders and service users to get a deeper understanding of their experiences. And what we did was we aggregated all the findings by presenting some of the broad themes, as well as some of the unique phenomena that we saw from the collective review. So here's a profile of our participating organizations, and I know some of you are here today, so thank you very much. So these are our partner organizations that very graciously took time out of their busy schedule and supported us with this project and did an enormous amount of work for the review. So, you know, we had SALCO, we had the Schleifer Clinic, we had Islamic Family and Social Services Association from Alberta, we had Muslim Resource Center for Social Support and Integration, we had Punjabi Community Health Services Calgary, Luke's Place, Sakina Canada, Nissa Homes, and Victim Services of Durham Region. We also had a total of 27 service users that took part in the focus groups and interviews. And we, you know, this goes to show, like, we had, and our goal was to get a lot more participants, but the fact that not many people reached out, even despite our repeated efforts to get them to participate or ask them to participate, it really goes to show how difficult it is for, you know, survivors and victims of gender-based violence to come forward, right? So that in itself is very telling. So just to give you a sense of who our participants were, so we had most of our participants from the age category 36 to 45. We didn't really have anybody below the age of 26 or over the age of 64. In terms of country of birth of participants, we had a whole range, as you can see in the graphs. Most people, for most of our service users, their first language was not English, but interestingly, they were all they're all comfortable speaking, reading, and writing English. With respect to income of participants, you can see that most are in the range of their income was 20,000 and less. So most people were in this range. And for most people, their income source was government assistance, with the second the second part of the graph showing 37% having their income source as having their jobs as their income source, and then we have some from their business and some from their children. In terms of living arrangement, we saw that none of the participants, or none of the respondents rather, were still living with their abuser. And most people had safe access to technology, so cell phone, computer, internet, and email, and most were comfortable with using technology as well. So we asked these questions because we tried to get a sense of who we were speaking to, and you know, how their background or their experiences told us stories about their specific experiences of violence. So now I'm going to take some time just to present some of the very key findings from the review. Of course, there's a lot in the report, and we don't have time to go through all of it in this session. But of course, the report is now online, and you're welcome to read it. So I'm going to just present some brief highlights from the review. So when we looked at, looking at the background, some of the background and contextual information, you can see from the graphs or service user profile that violence really cuts across all age groups, income levels, and ethnicities. So it's not really limited to one specific group. All the organizational leaders that we interviewed indicated that intimate partner violence, or IPV, was the most common type of violence that they saw amongst their Muslim identifying clients. Only 22% mentioned workplace discrimination and harassment as one of the forms of violence that they saw. And 33% mentioned the involvement of extended family, such as in-laws, in intimate partner violence. And all said that IPV increased significantly during the COVID-19 pandemic. Within intimate partner violence, most organizations acknowledged the presence of physical violence, but we saw a theme of non-physical violence being more common than physical among the responses. The prevalence of coercive control was highlighted as a significant form by 56% of our organizational respondent. Emotional, financial, spiritual abuse came up frequently as forms of violence that were more prevalent than physical. And this is interesting. Sexual violence actually did not come up as a commonly reported form of violence in the responses. And this also matches what we saw in the responses by our service users. So even when we interviewed and during the focus group discussions with service users, most respondents mentioned experiencing intimate partner violence, with a few people also experiencing violence from their extended family. And out of those who disclosed the type of IPV they faced, the most commonly reported violence, again, was emotional and psychological violence. And so physical and financial actually came up after. And sexual abuse, again, was the least frequent response, which again really tells us something, right? Because it seems like we already know that sexual abuse is severely underreported, right? And this is also the case within the sample group that we had as service users who participated in this study. And so it really tells us something about why people are not coming forward and what the barriers are and how we can assist people to come forward. So even though IPV came up as the most frequent response, it's not necessarily true that that is actually the most common form of violence that is occurring in the community. There may be other forms of violence that's simply not being reported. And we also have to keep in mind that in our participant pool, we didn't see responses from younger women or older women, so we don't really see other types of violence, for example, harassment in the workplace or elder abuse or human trafficking. So we do need to do a larger study to be able to get those answers as well. So here's some of the quotes that our participants shared about emotional psychological violence. So they said that most of the domestic abuse was not physical. People don't understand how hard that is. Police didn't believe me. They didn't help me because I wasn't bruised enough and because I couldn't prove it. Sakina Canada, one of our partners, said that there isn't much support for emotional abuse in mainstream society. For example, proof of abuse is required within a specific period of time to be eligible for priority housing, but you cannot prove emotional or spiritual abuse. So when we also asked about what some of the common supports are that Muslim survivors of violence seek out, emotional support and counseling rose to the top as the most frequent response, and legal and shelter came after. Some organizations said that clients wanted specific information and advice around Islamic rights. Salco actually shared with us that, there are very few culturally competent spaces for Muslim women and South Asian women. And it's interesting because sometimes people don't want faith-specific or cultural-specific services, and they don't want to be seen in their own community. So that also tells us that clients, different individuals may have different needs. And so a client-centered approach would look at what really the client's needs are. But it's very interesting what this contextual sort of review showed us. So, we see that emotional and psychological violence is prevalent, but we also see that there's not enough support for emotional and psychological violence, and there's an unavailability of appropriate support and healing for that. So there's definitely a gap there. When we asked about barriers to reaching out, some of the themes that came up included lack of awareness of services, stigma and shame in the community. So a lot of people are afraid to speak out because they're afraid that they're going to be ostracized or the abuser is going to destroy their reputation in the community. A lot of people have lack of trust in the system and mainstream organizations because they don't see themselves being represented. Right. And we will see that more as we go into the policy program and service related review, the more specific review. And there's also a lot of fear around immigration status because oftentimes people's immigration status is tied to their abuser. So the abuser will use that as a tactic to keep them trapped in the relationship by saying things like, if you leave, I'm going to have you deported and things like that. And that may or may not be true. Right, that someone may lose status if they leave the relationship, but because of the lack of awareness of one's legal rights, women and people in abusive relationships often believe that message, and that keeps them trapped. When we asked about some current organizational efforts and challenges, some themes that came up in terms of efforts included having community workshops and empowering clients with information, community partnerships and advocacy, building trust and rapport with clients, having language-specific services, and providing hybrid services during the pandemic. And when it came to challenges, organizations shared things like limitations in capacity and funding, financial eligibility criteria for services. For example, Legal Aid Ontario, may have a cutoff for income in order to be eligible for their services. So in that sense, somebody who may need the services may not be eligible just because they're above the cutoff, but that doesn't mean that they make enough money to be able to afford legal services. So those are some of the challenges. Another organization shared with us the challenge around lack of consistent professional development and knowledge building. So the example that was given was that somebody might have a staff member may bring in certain skills. So for example, there might be a Muslim staff member who brings a certain framework or skill set into the organization. But if there's staff turnover, then that person leaves, they take the skill set with them, and there's not enough consistent knowledge building that ensures that the organization continues to have that knowledge base in, right? So there was that organization did express a need for collaboration with Muslim serving organizations, for example, CCMW, to have more training to make sure that there's a consistent skill set among staff members. Now we'll go briefly into the specific findings around policies, programs, and services. And again, there's a lot that we discuss in the report. And so I'm going to be presenting some very brief highlights. Under the human rights framework, when we looked at compliance with the human rights framework, policy, when we asked if organizations had a policy on anti-discrimination and anti-harassment, all respondents said that they did, but not many said that the policies clearly articulate what discrimination and harassment are, or whether they outline the obligations of management and staff, whether they provide for accommodation, whether they lay out the process of making a complaint about discrimination and harassment. So we see some inconsistency around the content of the policies, even though the policies do exist. And then all respondents said that their policies were available to everybody, including service users, but only 22% said that they were available and accessible in different formats. And that's a theme we see across all the frameworks, that when it comes to policy, even though they might exist, they're not necessarily consistently accessible to everybody. And all organizations said that their employees were aware of the policy documents, but less than half of the organizations mentioned that clients were educated and oriented on their rights when they began receiving services. And when we asked service users in the focus groups and interviews whether somebody read to them a policy on anti-discrimination or whether they were educated on their rights, about 41% said they answered no, right? So that was an interesting finding. When it came to program design and implementation, most respondents said that they provided language access either through interpreters or multilingual racialized staff. And a recurring theme that came up was that hybrid services that were provided created accessibility, but it also created barriers for those who didn't have technology or were still living with abusers. Physical accessibility of buildings, that came up as a theme. 56% of organizations said that their buildings were physically accessible, so that's clearly an area of improvement. Few organizations mentioned that they provided transportation support and food vouchers as part of their accessibility efforts. And when it came to service delivery practices, all service user respondents said that they didn't face any unfair treatment or discrimination, and overwhelmingly mentioned that they were happy with services. But we also have to keep in mind that many people don't come forward with complaints of discrimination and harassment because they're simply not aware of their rights. So that's something to keep in mind. When we looked at compliance with a trauma and violence informed approach, only 33% of organizations stated that they had a dedicated policy on a trauma and violence informed approach. So they may have principles of trauma and violence informed approach embedded in other policies, but in terms of a dedicated policy, not many organizations had that. And most of them stated that they developed the policies in consultation with survivors and victims and experts. So that's clearly an area of strength. I do want to share a model that Victim Services Durham Region shared with us, which I think is a great example of best practice. So they stated that they have a survivor panel that informs all of their policy and program development. So I think that's a really good example of how we can incorporate the input and expertise of survivors and victims as we're developing policies and programs. Again, as I mentioned, as with the human rights policies, the policies are available, but they're not necessarily accessible. So not all organizations had an online version, or not everybody had it in different formats. And of course, we recognize that there's resource challenges too, right? So there's not always enough funding to have them translated in different languages, to have them available in different formats. So there's those systemic issues there too. Again, with program design and implementation, examples of how organizations were making efforts to make sure that their programs were trauma and violence informed approach. They said that, they had presence of multilingual staff. They took steps to ensure safety, such as basic conflict checking, providing ancillary support, such as food vouchers and support for religious observations, training their staff on a trauma and violence informed approach. And again, all organizations said that diverse groups of survivors were consulted when developing the programs that they reviewed. So again, a clear area of strength. Examples of challenges that were shared with us include resource challenges due to project work rather than long-term programming. Some mentioned lack of specialized services for Muslim women in mainstream organizations, such as Muslim counselors, and some of our service users also expressed their need or their desire to have faith-based counseling, and this was actually a recurring theme in the focus groups that came up. Some mentioned the risk of providing virtual services if the survivor victim is still living with the abuser. And one organization also mentioned not having mandatory mental health support, which could increase the level of trauma and prevent growth and healing. Across all four frameworks, when it came to service delivery practices, we really received an overwhelmingly positive response. So all respondents said that staff were kind, respectful, and supportive. They said that their experiences were validated. Because we paid attention to every single story, we also wanted to highlight that one participant mentioned her dissatisfaction with the quality of an interpreter. One participant indicated the importance of not making assumptions about one's culture and learning more about the person's culture. Another person talked about the importance of advocacy. So these were all stories that were shared by our service users in terms of how to, what their experience was and what their recommendations were in terms of improvement. Even with the ARAO policy, 56% of organizational respondents said that they had a policy. And for those who didn't have a dedicated policy, it was either an assumed part of their existence or the principles were incorporated in another policy. And 71% said that their human resources policies emphasized the hiring of diverse staff and management and the appointment of a diverse board to ensure representation of the client group. So that's, one way to ensure that clients have that trust because they see themselves represented in the organization. Again, accessibility, there's inconsistent approaches. Even though policies were available, they were not necessarily accessible across the board. They didn't have them in different formats and different languages. In terms of program design and implementation, 85% of organizations stated that program design was informed by the lived experiences of service users. And so this was clearly an area of strength that we saw across the board where service users' lived experience was really taken into account in program design and implementation. Other efforts for inclusion included providing free programs, alternating dates and times for webinars, recognizing triggers, assigning a caseworker from a specific racial background if that was requested, providing resources in plain language, having a diverse staff team. So those were different examples that organizations shared with us. Interestingly, within the ARAO framework, when we asked questions about whether service users were aware of available services before they needed help, 65% stated that they didn't. So this was a huge area that we identified as a gap where people are simply not aware of where to seek help, and they're trying to scramble to find information once they're in a situation of violence. And we had participants tell us that, please have services advertised more widely. And, I have a couple of quotes here from our service users that were shared with us on this topic. So one participant said, maybe having more advertising about where to get help in community centers and in different languages. Another person said, I truly wish I had known about them before. And, she's referring to the organization. I would suggest mosques having people peer groups, counseling that women and young people can talk to, even if it's through the phone, or having the organization have a poster in the local mosque, letting them know about services. CCMW can put something on the radio channel about available services. We need more awareness of services. We need safe spaces for talking about LGBTQ issues, bullying, etc. So this is what we're hearing directly from participants about where the gaps are in terms of making people aware of organizations and services. With respect to cultural safety, only 22% of organizations stated that they had a specific policy on cultural safety, but majority said that they had these principles built into other policies or guidelines. 60% said that the policies had requirements of cultural safety training. And 80% of organizations said that their policies were accessible. And again, with respect to program design and implementation, all organizations developed them with input of service users. All organizations said that their staff and program facilitators represented target groups. And again, we heard from a number of service users about the importance of having faith-specific services within mainstream organization. And when it came to service delivery practices, again, participants felt safe and respected, but a number of participants talked about the importance of service providers ensuring that women who are seeking services have an understanding of their faith. So they wanted service providers to empower women to understand their rights in Islam and to help them understand that abuse is not acceptable in their faith, because I think from their experience, a lot of them were internalizing, what they've been told in the community, that, they don't have certain rights within their faith, or, they don't have power or agency, which is not what the faith teaches. And so what they were requesting through the focus group discussions and interviews is that organizations have the skill set to empower women by validating their experience and, encouraging them by using their faith, right? So they needed faith-based validation. But we also saw the opposite. Some people said that, they didn't get the help that they needed from the community, so they didn't want faith-specific services. So again, it comes down to really understanding, if we're going to, apply a trauma-informed or culturally safe approach, it's really trying to understand what is it that the client is asking for and providing that service accordingly. So those were some of the key findings, and I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to wrap up very quickly so that we have a few minutes for questions and comments. So now that we, after in the report, after we present the findings, we do provide some ideas for strategies for change and recommendations. So we have some broad strategies, and then we have some specific policy, program, and service related strategies. So very quickly, in terms of broad strategies, we suggest, beginning with the understanding that Muslim communities are diverse and the needs of women, girls, trans and gender diverse individuals who identify as Muslim will differ based on their intersectional needs. We also recommend combining strategies to address gender-based violence with efforts to prevent Islamophobia, racism, and prejudices against Muslim communities. So it's very important that when we try to take a culturally safe approach and try to provide services that are in accordance with the needs of the clients, we also at the same time not stereotype against the community as a whole, or not, so for example, if we look at intimate partner violence, we shouldn't be assuming automatically that just because this is a Muslim woman, her extended family is going to be involved, or just because she's from the Muslim community, she's going to need faith-specific services, or she's not going to need faith-specific services. So not, making those assumptions. Increasing outreach in the community to get a better sense of the needs of the groups who are not coming forward. So really building partnerships with mosques, with settlement agencies, with community centers, Islamic schools, to see where significant populations, Muslim populations are, and to see how we can collaborate to really understand their needs. Advertise services widely by creating plain language brochures and flyers, collecting demographic data, which is really, really important. Demographic data on service users to determine percentage of Muslim clientele and to have a better understanding of their predominant service needs. Mutual education and training, greater coalition building between Muslim serving and mainstream organizations, prioritizing systemic advocacy, And also addressing stigma in the community by continuing to educate about ways to recognize different forms of violence, and also support victims and survivors by providing them with safety and care within the community. When it came to specific recommendations around policies, programs, and services, we have some examples of recommendations we have is to really have dedicated policies, right, on human rights, trauma-informed approaches, ARIO, and cultural safety. Making sure that staff, board, and management are completing mandatory trainings on these policies and the principles, and ensuring that service users are educated on their rights and are aware of policies, and ensuring that the policies are accessible and available in different formats in plain language, having a diverse panel of survivors and victims that can advise on policy and program development. When it comes to program design, of course, expanding on language-specific services, even if we have interpreter services, vetting interpreter quality, providing flexible timing for programs, prioritizing physical accessibility of spaces, arranging for halal food, prayer breaks, prayer spaces for in-person sessions, also checking for compliance with laws around disability rights, consistent, and also having a consistent and accessible feedback mechanism for programs. Again, ensuring that staff, board, and management are completing mandatory trainings, having a robust referral system, having a client-informed approach to program design, having better mental health and emotional support available. This was, of course, a key need that was identified by both our organizational leaders and service users. And an important part is focusing on staff wellness by hiring a mental health coach or counselor, right, to avoid vicarious trauma and to make sure that staff are equipped to provide the services that clients need, and diversifying staff, board, and management to represent as many target groups as possible. Collaborating with mainstream organizations again, and also collaborating with religious leaders in the community, but also researching on their credibility, right, to prevent any harm and re-traumatization. Some examples of service-related changes or recommendations: consistently checking in with clients about their accommodation needs. When programs are delivered, being mindful of prayer times for clients, providing necessary breaks. If physical space is not available, providing alternatives to clients to meet in a safe space. And, a lot of organizations are already practicing these things, but it's good to, have these as best practices so that, we can all learn from each other and build on them. Exercising compassion without making any judgments or assumptions about someone's faith, checking in with client preferences for services. And this is really important because this was mentioned as one of the biggest challenges with hybrid services, right? Which came about during the pandemic, that when remote services were provided, even though it provided accessibility, a lot of people, who were still living with their abusers, they were not able to use the technology, or because they didn't have access to technology, or even if they did, they were just simply not in a safe space to be able to use that technology. So really asking questions to do a risk assessment of what would be safe for the client, and providing services accordingly. Again, advertising services widely, different languages, providing flyers in mosques and other community organizations. An important piece is also to work with police to train them to provide information brochures about services to clients. So this was mentioned as one of the recommendations that this came directly from one of our service users who participated in the focus group, actually, because they told us that it would be really helpful if organizations worked with police to train them to provide the information when clients were in contact with police in a situation of gender-based violence. Another idea is to advertise in ethno-specific mainstream TV and radio channels. So, and again, going back to the broad strategies, refraining from assumptions about experiences and fates of Muslim women, creating safety by understanding the client's reality and asking them what they need and want. So I know this was a lot of information, so I'm going to end here, and I know we have just a few minutes for questions and comments. So thank you all for your attention and for coming tonight. And the report is available on the CCMW website. So thank you.
Are there any questions or comments? I know we don't have a lot of time left, but please feel free. You can raise your hand, or you can post in the Q&A or in the comments if you have any questions. Thank you, Silmi. That was a really comprehensive report. There was a lot of information. Anam
Thank
has
you.
her hand up. Go ahead, Anam. Oh, you're muted.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. My question is about introducing the term narcissistic abuse, because from what I understood is that based on the discussions within the community, sometimes it's harder for people to identify one specific nature of the abuse to call it an emotional abuse or psychological, because narcissistic abuse is something that is very complicated, but it's very abusive.
Mhm.
But what I noticed is that based on the discussions that people just get it, they're like, yes, we are all in under narcissistic abuse, but we don't know where to go to seek help because of the complicated nature of the because of the complication of the abuse itself, and also the fact that usually that type of abuse is hard to prove, or it comes a lot with the how a person would look like within the community, or there are many reasons for people not to speak up. But at the same time, it is widely discussed in social gatherings very openly. So if that is introduced in the report, that term, then my anticipation is that there might be more people showing up because it is becoming more common to talk about it. And that's when people open up that what exactly are they facing under that particular
Mhm.
umbrella.
Mhm.
Whereas the other terms of abuse could be little daunting for some, just they might not be ready to come forward to speak about it.
Yeah, no, I agree. Thank you very much. We'll definitely make that amendment in the report, because I think we mentioned coercive control as, an aspect of emotional and psychological violence, but no, narcissistic abuse is not a term that's explicitly used. So
That's right. And then there is narcissistic abuse awareness as well that happens every day as well. So I
right.
think it would be helpful to incorporate that as a form of abuse.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Agree.
Any more questions, comments? Oh, there's a question in the Q&A. Barbara has a question. She says, how can we encourage Muslim lawyers and Muslim health professionals to participate in our affordable and supportive assistance for people who want to separate and are safely able to work toward a resolution if the process is flexible? So Barbara is a lead founder of Separation Pathways.
Mhm.
Should I? If yeah. I just wanted to say that just as a background, I worked to create the domestic violence policy across North America for mediators and arbitrators. So I've worked closely with the Barbara Schleifer Clinic and Luke's Place and all of that. So I just want you to know that when I'm asking this, I'm asking it in the context of I care a lot about the domestic violence policy, but if someone is able to negotiate with their partner, provided you provide a safe process, and they want to separate and they don't want to go to court. One of the things that I've been looking for is to have Muslim professionals on the roster. We offer a very affordable process, very efficient and affordable and supportive and all of that. But I would like to have more people that would give that kind of cultural confidence that I saw in your report. And thank you very much for that. That you've done a lot of work. So congratulations on the
Thank
lot
you.
of work you've done. But I would like to be able to have people. We probably do have people on the roster already. I don't necessarily ask their faith, but we have people of diverse backgrounds. So I just wanted to put it out there because we make it very efficient and very easy for people to work with us. We provide a lot of support. And but I know that people feel better when they have someone that they feel understands their cultural needs. And so I'm just reaching out for that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's a really great point. And what I'm thinking, and Nuzhat, please, feel free to jump in. I think it would be great for you to speak to Sabrine, my colleague.
I have,
Sabrine.
yeah.
So,
Sabrine's been Sabrine was part of our discussions from when we began this several years ago, but we haven't been in touch since she gave birth.
Because she manages a whole list of roster, Muslim lawyers who are on our roster. So I think it'd be great if the two of you, connect, and then perhaps she can provide some ideas of how,
if you get a chance to anybody to look at separationpathways.ca, you'll see our brand new website, and you'll get an idea of what we're trying to do.
Right.
But we very much want to be available to people who have limited means and people who are anxious and need a friendly, supportive process. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you,
Barbara. I think we are a little over time, but let's take these calls and then we'll end after we've addressed them. So Raja has actually got a question. Do you think the absence of sexual abuse is due to lack of understanding of what sexual abuse is, or due to our Islamic beliefs when it comes to the relationship between a husband and his wife?
I mean, I think that's part of it, right? But we also know that sexual abuse is not limited to a husband-wife relationship, right? So it's a lot broader than that. So I think part of it, and this is my sense, of course, when we speak to more people who are experiencing sexual abuse, I think we can get a better sense of why is it that people don't come forward. But my sense is that it's a taboo to talk about, right? And yes, I think part of it is also people don't understand what it is, and people don't understand where to go for help, and people are afraid that if they do speak about it, maybe they won't be, I guess their reputation is going to be affected in the community. I think these are all like different reasons why people don't reach out. So, I'm not sure, Nuzhat, if you have anything to add to that.
I do want to address it because we've been trying to see if we can focus on sexual violence in our communities, because people don't want to tackle that topic. There's a lot of stigma attached to it. People don't feel safe. There's a very good organization that actually investigates abuse in our communities that may be perpetrated by leaders in our communities. The organization is called FACE, which investigates incidents of abuse in our communities, sexual abuse in our communities. So we don't talk about it a lot, and probably one of the reasons why it didn't come up as an answer, the type of abuse experienced, is because of the stigma attached to it. Not that they didn't experience it, they just, may not have wanted to talk about it.
And I also want to add that a lot of times when people try to talk about it, they're not believed, right? So I think that's also a huge deterrent. Like, even if people start to speak about it, and we know that a lot of times it happens within close family members or extended family. So, if it's an uncle or a cousin and you go and try and tell your parents that this is what happened, and people just don't believe, right? So I think, and it just shuts down the conversation right there. So I think that's also one of the reasons.
And that's really one of the reasons why we want to study it, to learn more about Muslims' experiences, because we don't have that research. We don't have any, like, CCMW likes to be evidence-based, but we don't even know where to begin in collecting the data, because people are so reluctant to come forward. And Silmi's so right. They're not believed if they come forward. There's a lot of doubt. People start blaming them for even, especially because, as we know, a lot of that abuse is unfortunately perpetrated by someone close. Could be a
Yeah.
relative, could be a close friend. So it's a really difficult situation for the victim or survivor to come forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Rasha, you've got it. People do blame the victim by saying, yes, it must be her fault. She must have enticed,
Yeah.
the user. So, I don't want to keep everybody for too long because it was a long day. Is there, let's see, another question? No, it's just a thank you. And is there any information about honorarium? So can you, if you would like to, maybe get in touch with us at gbv@ccmw.com. We can respond to you if you were one of the participants. Okay, so gbv@ccmw.com. Great. All right. Well, thank you all so much for attending. And thank you, Silmi, for a comprehensive presentation. There was a lot of content. Can you drop that in the chat? Sorry, Cynthia, gbv@ccmw. So if you have questions, you can certainly email us there. And our report is now available online. The links were provided earlier in the chat, but just go to our website, www.ccmw.com, and you should be able to find the report. I think, Zainab, is it on the front page now or on the landing page?
It should be on the landing page. It's also under resources.
Right. So Zainab has put in the link to the report. By the way, it's a really excellent report. Silmi did a very good job. There was a lot of data, a lot of information to synthesize into into this report. And you'll find it really useful for your organizations as well, because one of the things that I really liked about the project, this was our approach, was to identify best practices as well as gaps. So there's lots of best practices included. So you can, look at those. And then you can also look at what we're recommending in terms of addressing the gaps. So with that, thank you. Have a good night. And hopefully you'll join us for future events. We always have events going on. So check us out, ccmw.com. Thanks, everyone. And
Thank you,
please
everyone.
take care of yourselves.